All right. Again, for those of you who just joined us, I'd like to welcome you. My name is Joy Fisher-Williams, and I'm a marketing manager with Bedford St. Martin's Macmillan. I'm responsible for literature, among other parts of our English list. And we are so delighted that you've joined us today. I imagine many of you are coming from classes, and we really appreciate you making the time for this session. What we'd like to do is make some brief introductions, but first I want to walk through a couple of quick logistics. So we're going to kick the webinar off right after the introductions, and as you can see on your screen, we're encouraging you, if you have any questions, particularly when we pause for questions, to enter those in the chat window. The chat window should appear at the top of your screen, or perhaps over to the side you'll see a participants field, a chat field, and a Q&A field, and we're asking that you use the chat. If you have trouble with the audio, we've provided with a toll-free 800 number that you can use to dial in, including an access code. And we are also going to be recording this webinar. We'll make that available to everyone who's registered, so no worries. If you have any difficulties, we'll make sure you can access the recording. As I said, my name is Joy, and I'm responsible for the marketing of literature at Bedford St. Martin's, but I am joined by some wonderful colleagues, particularly a few folks who are going to be able to help you with answering your questions as we move through today's webinar. Karen Henry, our publisher, is on the line. Vivian Garcia, our sponsoring editor, is also here. Jillian Daniels is our marketing assistant. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Rachel Goldberg, who's our senior development editor. Rachel?
Thank you, Joy. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Russ McDonald. Russ McDonald is professor of English literature at Goldsmiths College, University of London. Having taught at 5 American universities, he is the winner of multiple awards for distinguished teaching, including North Carolina Professor of the Year. For a decade, Russ helped to direct the NEH-sponsored Teaching Shakespeare Institute for secondary teachers at the Folger Library, and his pedagogical commitment led to his publishing the widely adapted Bedford Companion to Shakespeare. He is also the co-author with Lena Cowan-Orlin of The Bedford Shakespeare. A specialist in Shakespeare's poetic language, he has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Folger Shakespeare Library, and the Mellon Foundation. His scholarly works include Shakespeare's Late Style, Shakespeare and the Arts of Language, and other books and articles on Shakespeare and early modern writing and culture. In 2010 to 2011, Russ served as president of the Shakespeare Association of America. He also regularly writes for Opera Magazine, and it is my pleasure to turn it over to Russ.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you also, everyone at Bedford, for all the scrupulous care with which you've set this program up. This webinar is fortunate in its timing, coming as it does less than 2 weeks after the appearance of a provocative essay by Stephen Greenblatt in the New York Times about the teaching of Shakespeare. The foremost American Shakespeare scholar of our time, Greenblatt, as always, brings to his subject a penetrating intelligence and an elegant prose style, and his position as Cogan Professor of the Humanities at Harvard gives him a kind of papal authority in matters of education having to do with the Renaissance. His piece is entitled, "Why I Can No Longer Teach the Shakespeare I Love," and Greenblatt's main argument is that young people in the second decade of the 21st century do not respond to the plays in the same way that he himself did, or in the way that his students have responded reliably in the past. The quotation you see on your screen, "Even the highly gifted students in my Shakespeare classes at Harvard are less likely to be touched by the subtle magic of his words than I was so many years ago, or than my students were in the 1980s in Berkeley, California." I'm prepared to agree with Greenblatt that the transmission of the subtle magic of Shakespeare's language is more difficult now than it was 3 decades ago, but I do not take this as justification for teaching another Shakespeare than the one I love. Those features of the plays that thrill me are those that have thrilled readers and audiences for 400 years. In literary studies these days, context has become a kind of tyrant, sometimes subjugating and even effacing altogether that text that formerly served as the central object of study. But I'm unwilling to give up that text. Although teachers must be ever sensitive to the student audience they are addressing, I still want to give my students the opportunity to take pleasure in the things that have proved pleasurable to me over the course of a lifetime of reading. To my mind, the most powerful source of satisfaction in reading or watching a Shakespeare play is the words. Interestingly, I had exactly the same experience as Greenblatt did with As You Like It. I didn't like it. That was in the 10th grade. But then in the 12th grade, with the benefit of a great teacher, the Shakespearean world opened to me. We read Twelfth Night and Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra, and I was enchanted by the sound of the language. I remember after school greeting friends from that English class with, "Is execution done on Cawdor?" As most everybody is now aware, Shakespeare is not celebrated for his stories, mainly because he borrowed virtually all of them. The plots that underlie Romeo and Juliet and Othello and Henry V exist in many versions and a variety of languages. They are great stories. Shakespeare may not have been a great originator of plots, but he certainly knew a good one when he saw it, and his great gift was that he learns to put it in language that would make it live for centuries. Now, this presentation is divided into 3 parts, focusing on 3 different aspects of the Shakespearean text. Part 1 is devoted to a long and potentially puzzling speech in Romeo and Juliet. In this section, I talk about paraphrase, about straightforward but important features such as narration and imagery and characterization. Part 2 takes up wordplay, picking out some examples from one of Shakespeare's great middle comedies, Twelfth Night. Part 3 is concerned with patterns, schemes of sounds, of words, phrases, syntax. And in that section, I skip around a bit and then finally light on a single play, Macbeth, and consider a celebrated passage from that text. I will from time to time talk about students and their responses to some of this language and some of these patterns. I should say at the outset, however, that I regard this webinar as a kind of demonstration rather than as an instructional aid or as a series of recommendations on how one ought to teach a Shakespeare play. In thinking about these examples and these methods, I show you how I address some of these topics and encourage you to adapt the principles or methods to your own particular classes and needs. The one piece of pedagogical advice I will propose is this, a principle I have found to be true over some 40 years of teaching. If you can identify for yourself what excites you about a play or a passage, and if you can articulate for yourself the sources and nature of that excitement, then you will be able to transmit that excitement to your students in ways that will certainly reward you and reward them. I think you never learn anything as well as when you have to teach it to others. The fear and adrenaline that go into preparation are tremendously positive factors. In fact, I very often do better at teaching a work that I don't know very well than a work that I do know very well. And the reason is that I'm excited by the discoveries I seem to have just made about it. But this webinar is not a pedagogical lesson. It is rather an exemplum of the pleasures of reading and watching. So, part 1, reading a speech. One way of encouraging students to confront the language of the plays is to concentrate on a single speech, preferably a fairly lengthy one, to make sure that they understand exactly what the speaker is saying from line to line. You, or they, can then go on to some more sophisticated speculations on how the speech reveals the character of the speaker, how it fits into the thematic structure of the play, whatever. But first, it is necessary to guarantee that we follow it, that we understand what the words mean. I have often found that large chunks of text are especially challenging for students, that long speeches can sometimes be the most formidable. Usually, dialogue is more accessible to beginning readers than a single speech because one speaker is responding to another, and readers can follow the exchange by noting those responses and by backing up when they lose the thread. An excellent piece for demonstrating the importance of this basic understanding is the nurse's introductory speech in the 3rd scene of Romeo and Juliet. It has been my frequent experience that I will enter the classroom and ask a group of students who have certainly read the play, to tell me what the speech is about. And the response to that question is often downcast eyes and uncomfortable silence. And so we begin to look at sentences. In this analysis, I will not overlook entirely various poetic and literary effects, but my main focus is going to be on denotation, on simple meaning. We find out from the nurse and Lady Capulet in the exchange preceding the speech that Juliet is 13 years old, just a little over 2 weeks shy of her 14th birthday. On July 31st, at night, she will be 14. And so the nurse begins her speech. Even or odd, of all the days in the year, come Lammas Eve at night shall she be 14. Susan and she, oh God rest all Christian souls, were of an age. Well, Susan is with God. She was too good for me. But as I said, on Lammas Eve at night shall she be 14. That shall she marry, I remember it well, to since the earthquake now 11 years. And she was weaned, I never shall forget it, of all the days of the year upon that day. For I had then laid wormwood to my dug, sitting in the sun under the dove house wall. My lord and you were then at Mantua. Nay, I do bear a brain. But, as I said, when it did taste the wormwood on the nipple of my dug, and felt it bitter, pretty food, to see it tetchy and fall out with the dug. Shake, quoth the dove house. 'Twas no need, I trow, to bid me trudge. And since that time it is 11 years, for then she could stand high lone. Nay, by the rood, she could have run and waddled all about. For even the day before, she broke her brow. And then my husband, God be with his soul, he was a merry man, took up the child. Yea, quoth he, dost thou fall upon thy face? Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit, wilt thou not too? And by my holidam, the pretty wretch left crying and said, I, to see now how a jest shall come about. I warrant I should live 1,000 years, I never should forget it. Wilt thou not too, quoth he? And pretty fool, it stinted and said, Aye. Enough of this, I prithee, hold thy peace. The speech is a nurse's recollection of the girl's 3rd birthday, the day she was weaned. A nurse in the Renaissance was a woman who nursed children, fed them milk from her own breast. Upper-class women in that period did not usually nurse their own children, but gave the task to a servant who herself had children and thus could feed the mistress's infants. The speech contains in its first few lines a great instance of a Shakespearean teaser, the sudden entrance and immediate disappearance of Susan. Who? Who is Susan? We don't know. Most likely, the context suggests, she was the nurse's own child who died early. But we can't be sure of that. She could have been another woman's daughter. This is one of those tiny, suggestive stories buried within a larger story, buried within a larger story. And Shakespeare increases the mimetic effect of his character and her story by not fully explaining it. Like other such examples of this device, the momentary arrival of Susan adds texture to the narrative. The nurse reminisces explicitly about the day of Juliet's weaning. On this day, 11 years ago, Lord and Lady Capulet were out of town, having gone from Verona to Mantua, and the nurse recalls sitting in the sunshine under the dove house wall. It's a beautiful concrete image, a picture of the woman enjoying the Italian summer as she goes about the business of weaning the child. She'd put wormwood on her breast, that is, taken the juice from a bitter plant and applied it to her nipple. The effect is to make the child reject the breast and thus get used to eating only solid food. But then, suddenly, earthquake. The dove house begins to rattle and tremble. One of the nurse's characteristics that makes the speech both a little difficult and charming as well is that she can't seem to stay on one subject. Here she shifts back and forth between the process of weaning and the earthquake that occurred that summer 11 years before. The little girl is tetchy and falls out with the dug. In other words, she doesn't like the taste of the wormwood and gets fussy. Then the earth begins to shake and the dove house rattles. The nurse runs away from the structure for fear of being injured. Shake, quoth the dove house. The word quoth, meaning said, isn't as strange as it seems. We would say something similar. We would say, shake went the dove house. So we now shift to the second half of the speech, in which the nurse recalls the verbal exchange between the toddler Juliet and the nurse's husband. Juliet could walk and run on her own, and just the day before had fallen and raised a bump on her brow, which led the nurse's husband, a merry man, to make an off-color joke. Yea, quoth he, dost thou fall upon thy face? Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit, wilt thou not, Jule? It's a sexual image. She falls forward as a little girl and bumps her head, but when she's old enough for sexual experience, she will fall backwards with a man on top of her. Most of us are familiar with a family relative, usually male, often elderly, but sometimes just a bad boy, who likes to say suggestive things that a child can't quite understand, or wants to teach a child to say smutty words that it doesn't know the meaning of, and that's the case with the nurse's husband and Juliet. And to his little joke, Juliet responds affirmatively, and by my holiday, the pretty wretch left crying and said, "Aye." She doesn't know what he means, but charmingly, she agrees to his prediction, a prediction that is soon to come true. The memory of this exchange leads into the final section of the nurse's speech, essentially a recapitulation of the same story of the falling and the laughing that she has just concluded. Like many another elderly relative, the nurse repeats herself constantly and more than once. Lady Capulet asks her to keep quiet, and yet the nurse plows forward. Yes, madam, yet I cannot choose but laugh to think it should leave crying and say, "Aye," and yet I warrant it had upon its brow a bump as big as a young cockerel stone, a perilous knock, and it cried bitterly. Yea, quoth my husband, fall upon thy face, thou wilt fall backward when thou comest to age, wilt thou not, Jule? It stinted and said, Aye, and stint thou too, I pray thee, nurse, say aye. One significant detail is added here. The bump on Juliet's brow is said to be as big as a young cockerel stone. In other words, as large as the testicle of a rooster. There are sexual undercurrents throughout the speech. The episode is a great instance of a story within a story, and it's worth making a few general observations about its contribution to the play at large. In the first place, the speeches are in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. That fact contradicts the conventional wisdom that upper-class characters speak in verse, while servants and low characters speak in prose. Certainly we can agree that speech contributes to characterization. The nurse is a gabby, scattered old lady whose love of talking is accompanied by her obvious affection for the teenage Juliet. As part of the play's symmetrical structure, Romeo has a corresponding aged confidant in Friar Lawrence. But Shakespeare is able to do much more with the nurse than merely use her for comic effect, or for what we used to call comic relief. In fact, the nurse's repetitions create a kind of poetic density, something of a rhythmic incantation as she reverts to the story of Juliet's fall and her response to her husband's teasing. It's worth noting that the quotation of the little Juliet's "I" occurs 4 times, and we ought to wonder at the function of a device that the playwright has seen to repeat so extravagantly. As I've indicated, this is a long speech, very expensive in theatrical terms. In order to characterize a person as garrulous and scattered, you need a lot of lines. And yet the speech does nothing to advance the plot. In many film versions, it's omitted altogether. This recognition brings us to an interesting paradox. If a speech doesn't really accomplish anything in terms of advancing the narrative, then it seems clear that the author really wanted it to be there. It is long and potentially distracting, but certainly the playwright thought it worth including. The main subject of the speech is the weaning of the 3-year-old Juliet Capulet, her learning to become independent, her ability to walk on her own, and to feed herself. And that description of a milestone in the little girl's life is prophetically valuable in a play that depicts another milestone in the young girl's life, her falling in love with Romeo and marrying him, separating herself from her family, and acting independently in her choice of a lover and husband. In short, the play is a representation of the movement from childhood to maturity, and to this passage, the teenage Juliet says, I. The feuding families say no. The young lovers say yes, I. In fact, that little monosyllable comes up again and again in other contexts. In what we refer to as the balcony scene, immediately after Romeo spies Juliet at her window and delivers his hymn to her perfection, the girl's first words before she's aware of his presence, is I, me, she speaks. We ought also to remember that shortly before this moment, when Mercutio and friends have been searching for Romeo in the dark, Mercutio mocks all romantic folderol with cry but I, me, pronounce but love and dove. Juliet uses the word again when she speaks seriously to Romeo and tells him that she knows that she should pretend to be coy, but she won't. Fain would I dwell on form, fain deny what I have spoke, but farewell compliment. Dost thou love me? I know thou wilt say, I, and I will take thy word. She chooses to be absolutely direct with 4 monosyllables. Dost thou love me? I know thou wilt say, I. And then, immediately after the death of Mercutio and the death of Tybalt, when the nurse enters with that bad news, Juliet works herself into a paroxysm of confusion and grief based upon the word I. But I, and that bare vowel I, shall poison more than the death-darting eye of cockatrice. I am not I, if there be such an I. Or those eyes shut that make the answer I. If he be slain, say I, or if not, no. Brief sounds determine my weal or woe. So we have 1 signifier and 3 signifieds. I meaning assent, I in the sense of the first person singular, and I, E-Y-E, the ocular organ. The nurse's speech also creates other kinds of color in the play as a whole. That process of being weaned, of walking on one's own and growing to maturity, carries consequences. In other words, the move from innocence to experience is painful. Juliet falls and raises a bump as big as a cockerel stone. And the movement into adulthood is similarly exhilarating and painful, as the second half of the tragedy depicts. The notion of a fall, in this case, the fall of a stumbling toddler, resonates with the traditional association between tragedy and a fall from high place. And it's not too much to say that this passage calls to mind even the fall of man from paradise into mortality, the costs of which Romeo and Juliet come to experience tragically.
If you have any questions, please answer them in the chat. I received 1 question from Joe Safdie. He says, I have what might seem a mere editorial question. I'm familiar with Professor McDonald's fine essay, To What End Are All These Words? Shakespeare's Dramatic Language, published almost 15 years ago. Has he had occasion to use, or substantially revise perhaps, the ideas he offered then?
Yes. I don't think that I can summarize the arguments I made at that point, but the more I look at the language, the more I find myself being knocked over by it, and every passage that I look at seems to reveal more than I thought was there. This is particularly clear in, as you will see at the end of this webinar, in that I took a passage that's pretty familiar and started looking at it and found all kinds of things that I had never seen before, and I've been teaching it for years and years and years. So one never comes to a state of stop when it comes to reading Shakespeare.
Thank you. Right now I'm not seeing any more questions.
That's fine. Should we go on to part 2?
Oh, wait, there's a question from Catherine R. Reskin. Do you lead the students to the reading you have just presented? How?
Do I lead them to the reading I've just presented?
Yes, that's
what Is that the question? Yes, that is, I wouldn't talk my way to them as I've done here. I would ask them questions because they will begin to talk about it. I mean, as I say, people will come into the classroom and they'll be looking down when I ask what it's about, and then someone will say, well, like, is it about breastfeeding? And then someone will say, yeah, that's sort of what I thought. And then they will talk a little more. And so then you begin to say, okay, well, what's the dove house? And what's the shaking about? And so then they begin to connect things. So I always do it in a kind of what's, sort of falsely called a Socratic way. But that seems to be, for me, the best way of getting people to see what's going on in the speech.
Excellent. I have a couple other questions. One from Jennifer Page. How do you prepare students to undertake this type of reading on their own?
Well, that's a hard thing, because some of them will be better at it than others to start with, and you've got to recognize that there is a pretty wide range of understanding in beginning students. I think that the best way of doing it is to model it. So, for example, one way of doing it would be to go through the exercise we just went through and talk about the various contents of the speech, and then give them another speech for the next class that's relevant to the things that you want to talk about in the next class, and see if they can pick out some of those details on their own.
Thank you. All right. Let's move on now in the interest of time.
Okay.
For those attending, please continue to ask your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Part 2 is wordplay. One feature that distinguishes Shakespearean speech is the abundance of wordplay, and I have found wordplay to be an especially productive tool for giving students a sense of pleasure as well as ownership and participation in the world of Shakespearean language. Many teenagers take delight in verbal brilliance. The survival of Monty Python for almost 50 years and other such exercises in wit and foolery attest to that enduring taste. And their minds can be stimulated and expanded by the recognition that wordplay is simultaneously exhilarating, silly, and meaningful. The writers and playgoers of Shakespeare's day obviously took delight in the multiplicity of language. The English tongue was expanding rapidly and excitingly throughout the 16th century, with many coinages of new words and imports of words from Romance languages, and thus there was a sense of the unlimited about expressive possibilities. Evidence of this sense of range is that there were no English dictionaries as we know them in the 16th century as Shakespeare was growing up. There were Latin English lexicons, of course, and other such reference books. But the first book that looks like an English dictionary as we know it was Robert Cawdry's A Table Alphabetical, published in 1604, and it was a specialist's work that is a collection of new and unusual words, as you see, abandon, cast away, etc. In fact, the Renaissance fascination with wordplay has a classical precedent. The supreme Roman authority on rhetoric and oratory, Quintilian, had acknowledged and indeed warned about the complexity of verbal signification. I turn to the discussion of ambiguity, which will be found to have countless species. Indeed, in the opinion of certain philosophers, there's not a single word which has not a diversity of meanings. Playwrights and playgoers took a much more relaxed and affirmative attitude to ambiguity. Shakespeare's positive view of equivocation was certainly shared by contemporary poets and playwrights. Philip Sidney's sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella, is full of puns, especially on the word rich, which was purportedly the surname of his married beloved. And the playwright John Marston was even more extravagant than Shakespeare in his exploitation of suggestive double meanings. But the neoclassicists, like their classical idols, took a different view. Wordplay is the feature that led Dr. Johnson to complain about Shakespeare's weakness for the pun. The quibble was to him the fatal Cleopatra for which he lost the world and was content to lose it. An uncommonly rich text for exploring the possibilities of wordplay is Twelfth Night, and the word with which Shakespeare plays almost obsessively, and which I would like to explore for a few moments, is the simple word will. Many of you will know that the subtitle for Twelfth Night is What You Will, which seems to be another way of saying as you like it. Today, the playwright might have chosen something like Twelfth Night or whatever. But the loaded possibilities of that word are manifold. In Lena Orland's and My Bedford Shakespeare, this is the moment in my presentation where we do the product placement. In the Bedford Shakespeare, we include at the end of each text an essential word in the text and list some of its most important meanings. And here is the example of will. In this case, the list is simplified because the definitions run to several pages in the Oxford English Dictionary. But it's worth spending a few minutes looking over the range of meanings and considering how Shakespeare's exploitation of these possibilities enriches our experience of the play. The etymology of the word is from the Old English willa, W-I-L-L-A, meaning mind, or determination, or purpose, and then that gets down to wish and pleasure and desire. A simple definition for the word will is desire, what one wishes to have or do, my will, my wish, or my purpose, or my desire. This downright sense of the word is obviously pertinent to a plot in which, before much time has passed, Orsino desires Olivia, Viola desires Orsino, Olivia desires Viola or Cesario, Antonio desires Sebastian, Malvolio desires Olivia also, and Sir Andrew thinks he desires Olivia. It's notable that there were no parents in Twelfth Night, and the one older figure who ought to be parental in wisdom and behavior, Sir Toby, is in fact the biggest adolescent of the lot. But the wills of the young, unmarried people are the drivers of the action and creators of the confusion that make the comedy so entertaining. Many of these characters are extremely willful. Think of Orsino, who persists in a hopeless love suit, of Olivia, who will not yield in her efforts to win the beautiful young page, even of Antonio, the old sailor, whose passion for Sebastian is so strong that he defies the danger of arrest and execution in order to be around the boy. Antonio uses the word will in its second sense, that is, the auxiliary verb indicating futurity and or purpose. I will do something, when he says that he will enter Illyria despite the prohibition. His affection for Sebastian is very great. I do love thee so that danger shall seem sport, and I will go. The power of the will is very strong in the realm of Illyria. The character with the strongest will, arguably, is Malvolio. The narcissistic and self-infatuated steward seeks to make his mistress fall in love with him. His desire is motivated, apparently, not by real affection or even sexual attraction, but rather by a desire to attain power and wealth and to implement his fantasies of revenge upon his opponents. When we break down the components of his name, we find that its meaning is ill will, Malvolio. The latter syllables related obviously to another synonym for will, the word volition. When we recognize that both the names of Viola, V-I-O-L-A, and Olivia, O-L-I-V-I-A, are near anagrams of Malvolio, then we begin to recognize the extent to which all the major characters are involved in this network of desire, this pursuit of their wills. Or another way of putting this is to say that Shakespeare's imaginative concentration on the problem of sexual desire, both legitimate and illegitimate, seeps into every aspect of the play. But other meanings of the word will were prevalent in the period, several of them sexually suggestive. A third meaning of the word will is lust or carnal desire, a sense that is most apparent in sonnets 135 and 136, the will sonnets, and the word will is played with so frequently there that we have to remember that will is also the abbreviated name of the poet. And in those sonnets, the poet toys not only with this meaning, but also with the more specific sexual meanings. To a 16th century audience, the word will could also mean penis, a sense which has survived in the modern British expression for penis, or willy. The word will can also denote vagina, a result of its similarity to the word for a deep hole, the word well, as when Mercutio says that his stab wound is not so deep as a well. Are we being too prurient in attributing sexual meanings to some pretty innocent terms? Did every listener respond with an awareness of the sexual sense at every use of the simple term? No, of course not. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. For example, when for the first time Cesario is shown into the room with Olivia and Mariah, Olivia's first line is, "Your will?" That's a straightforward use of the term, meaning your purpose or what do you want? Can I help you? But in a play in which sexual desire is so rampant, and in a scene in which, within 10 minutes of stage time, Olivia will be frankly lusting after the disguised Viola, we have to consider the sexual connotations of the word. Other words invite similar playfulness. Madness is one of the great themes of the play, especially in its farcical middle. Are all the people mad? Says one character at one point. And when Malvolio parades before Olivia cross-gartered and in yellow stockings, and Sir Toby arranges the ludicrous sword fight between the cowardly Sir Andrew and the properly unmanly Viola, and then poor Sebastian enters with that line, "Are all the people mad?" we see the significance of that emotion. Stephen Booth, in his book Precious Nonsense, has a rich and satisfying chapter on the last few minutes of the play in which he teases out the various verbal incarnations of the word: mad, madness, madman, madam, Madonna, that is my mistress. This glance at just some of the wordplay in Twelfth Night raises the question that we must inevitably ask upon noticing this prominent strain of poetic features. And that question, you've all heard it asked, although sometimes the tone is more challenging than one would like. The question is, so what? What is the point of all these double entendres? My way of thinking about this is to ask not why did Shakespeare include these devices, but rather what effect do these devices have? What contribution do they make to the play under study? And in this case, the answer is complicated. They contribute to both the mental activity generated by the work, and they contribute also to the meaning of the work. Mental activity is a form of excitement, of energy, of exhilaration. Our understanding leaps from one sense of the word will to the other. Cognitive scientists tell us that such a leap, such a transfer from one sense to another, creates in the human mind a chemical reward, a quick shot of dopamine, the neural transmitter that is also the source of pleasure in alcohol, in chocolate, in sex. In other words, recognition is a physical cause of delight. And the number of such cognitive leaps, such recognitions in a Shakespeare play is practically infinite. Shakespeare keeps the mind in motion, keeps it so much in motion that the sense of exhilaration is constantly thrilling. The double meanings we find in wordplay also create semantic value. In Twelfth Night, for example, a single word with two different meanings contributes much to a comedy in which the plot turns on the existence of twins, a single appearance, but two very different people. The pun is the verbal equivalent of twinship, and the contribution is not merely comic. In Richard III, the pun becomes a kind of battlefield as characters struggle with each other for the control of a word. In other words, two meanings are put in competition with each other. Shakespeare exploits repetition and double meanings, especially in Macbeth, notably in his toying with the word done. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. All our service in every point twice done, and then done double, in a play about double toil and trouble. I have done the deed, what's done is done, what's done cannot be undone. Paul thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, Dunsinane, Duncan, Donalbain. I could go on, but that concludes part 2.
All right, I received a few more questions. I'm not sure about the other panelists. Jennifer
I have
Evans.
one. Jillian,
yeah.
I have one.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, you go ahead. I'll follow.
Okay. I have a question from Jennifer Evans. Is there more wordplay in the comedies than the tragedies, since they are usually based on confusions and the wordplay creates implications?
Well, it's hard to say whether there's more. There's certainly more of a lighthearted kind than there is in the tragedies, although very often in comic scenes in the tragedies we get lots of punning, as with the porter in Macbeth, for example. But yeah, I think it's right to say that there probably is more prominent playing with language in the comedies, in which playing is very much part of the mood of the play. But then on the other hand, there are very, very prominent and important puns throughout the tragedies, as those we just looked at in Macbeth and in King Lear and Hamlet as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Liz Eckhart has a slightly long question, so I'm going to shorten it a bit. She says that she notices a difference between English students toward the structures of the plays and theater students who tend toward questions of performance. So you have English students, she says, in her classes who split toward the academic and literary questions, and theater students who want to know things like, how does Othello let us talk about race in America? Do you find a similar dynamic in your courses? How can we make productive connections between these?
Yeah, I think that there is that division. I think that they have to learn from each other. I think that both points of view should be encouraged, and that the English students should be encouraged to think theatrically, and the theater students should be encouraged to think literarily. One great example of this is Trevor Nunn, the great director for the Royal Shakespeare Company, who infuriates his casts because he makes the actors sit at a table for 2 weeks before he allows them to get on their feet, thus making sure that everybody knows everything about what's going on in the play. Everybody understands every line. But I think the question is a good one, and I think it's important that both points of view be respected.
Excellent. From Avi Mendelson, he says, what are the cognitive studies that say puns release dopamine? Fascinating stuff.
It is fascinating stuff, and I can't give you any footnotes at the moment. But well, there is a book actually by a woman named Gabrielle Starr called, oh, I can't remember. It's new. It's maybe a year or two old. The aesthetic response is in the subtitle. That's the best I can do at the moment. But you look at almost anything having to do with literary cognitive responses, and you'll find something about this.
Right. Karen, you said you have a question?
I have a couple more. Jennifer Dumont asked, do you give all credit to Shakespeare's, the author's genius, control of language, or to the genius of the text or language itself in your close reading?
I don't quite understand that, Karen. Can you explain that a little more?
I think and Jennifer might clarify, do you say it's the author's genius who knows how to manipulate language in this way, or is it sort of beyond the author and it's just language itself that kind of...
It's both. It's certainly both. There's no question about that. But then the fact is that Shakespeare can do it better than anybody else. But I'm jumping to my conclusion here, so I better stop.
Oh, well, I think this is sort of related. This is from Jenny Goranson.
Should we go on with part 3 in the interest of time?
Oh, can I test this one more that's connected? When students ask, how do we know Shakespeare meant to do that? What do you recommend saying to them? I know that all comes down to deep questions about literary theory, but do you have any recommendations for how to respond effectively to this? And maybe you're going to take that up in part 3.
Well, I'm not actually going to take it up in part 3, so I better address it sort of quickly. I always, there was a sentence back there that I went through maybe too quickly. I think an artist's concentration on a subject brings out all kinds of responses that even the author may not be aware of. You may not know how much you know as you begin to think about a subject and begin to write a poem or a story or a painting. Things may look different from the way you expected they would when you started the thing. So there is a kind of artistic set of connections that the author isn't necessarily in command of. But the answer is that no, Shakespeare didn't plant all of these things there, but they certainly do blossom.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Part 3?
Yes.
Patterns. This last section is concerned with patterns, that is, the arrangements of words that give pleasure by virtue of their arrangement. Very often they enhance meaning, but very often they don't, and the patterns are no less wonderful for that. Forms and patterns please us, creating what might be called verbal music. And for many of these verbal patterns stimulate a form of that same mental activity that I attributed to puns. Often it is not ostentatious, it does not grab the reader by the throat, but in its simple structures of repetition and variation, the pattern manages to please our ears when sometimes we aren't even aware that it does. There are also patterns that gratify the eye, specifically networks of imagery that please us with their frequent repetition, both identical and varied. Repetition is at the heart of all poetry, and we might remind ourselves of that fact by thinking of our favorite poems as children. In our earliest literary experiences, we are delighted with the repeated vowel sounds that lie at the heart of rhyme, and at the sometimes obsessive repetitions of words and phrases that we hear in books by Dr. Seuss and P.D. Eastman. These elemental delights are found frequently in Shakespeare, most notably in the rhymed couplets that often enliven the comedies. But patterns of repetition can be immensely complicated and can serve a variety of functions. The most common form of repetition we encounter in reading or seeing or listening to Shakespeare's plays is the metrical pattern, the alternating stress and non-stress of the unrhymed iambic pentameter. For example, Othello's speech to the Senate, "Her father loved me oft, invited me to question me the story of my life from year to year." Now, of course, an actor doesn't deliver it that way, but that is the oral substructure, the frame on which the dialogue or the speeches are constructed, and that creates a kind of ground bass, a kind of music that we hear. Sometimes the fundamental pattern will be varied slightly, as in the first line of Twelfth Night. "If music be the food of love, play on." There's a spondee there at the end, both accented usually in an actor's delivery. And sometimes it will be strikingly varied, as in the very first line of Richard III. It ought to be, "Now is the winter of our discontent," but that's nonsense. Richard grabs you by the throat. "Now is the winter of our discontent." And the next come patterns of phrasing or syntax, and for this purpose we might as well continue with Richard's speech. "Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures." I won't spend the time to do it now, but if you go back and look at this passage, it's the first 10 lines essentially of Richard III, you'll find patterns within patterns. Within that logical opposition of from A to B, there is a mix of related consonants and vowels that are very strikingly arranged. Networks of imagery can be especially satisfying to examine because they can confer a special flavor to a text. I'm thinking particularly of the images of black and white in Othello, enhancing and confusing as it does the problem of Othello's race and his status as a cultural outsider, or the famous cluster of vegetative images in Macbeth, the seeds of time, the seed of Banquo becoming king, the fruitless crown, the barren scepter, the moving branches that Malcolm uses to conceal his army and cleanse the kingdom. All these images in a play that depicts not growth, but violent death. Often, as I suggested about the passage from Richard III, Shakespeare thrills the listener with multiple simultaneously operative patterns. And once again, Macbeth provides brilliant examples of that method. So I want to spend some time on a single passage, arguably the most familiar passage in the play, and I want to spend time on it because it's familiar and yet it's made up of elements and systems of reiteration and variation that we take for granted. Such passages always offer more than they appear to. You are all familiar with it, Macbeth's meditation prompted by the news of his wife's death on the meaninglessness of life. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So we begin with simple verbal and oral sequences, repeated words and sounds that create in the perceiver a sense of pleasure in repetition. The Renaissance poetic teachers, such as George Putnam in The Art of English Poesy of 1589, they provide catalogs and Greek and English names for these various repetitive techniques, but I want to do without those terms and simply look at the density of the repeated units. Let's look just at the elements of exact repetition, tomorrow, 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 and, that full line of iambic pentameter made up of 2 words. Petty pace gives us the kind of doublet, the alliterative doublet, and then again, addictional day to day, then dusty death, out, out, poor player, struts and frets, tale told, full, fury, and then signifying nothing. These repetitions stimulate our brains chemically in the way I have described. And given the play's obsession with time, the first line of the play is when shall we three meet again? Seeing the future in the instant, the seeds of time, 'twere well it were done quickly, jumping the life to come. Thus it's hardly surprising to find many words and images having to do with the passage of time. Look at the patterns concerned with time. Tomorrow, creeps, petty, pace, day to day, time, yesterday's, brief, candle, hour, then, no more. And then, life is often figured as a journey, and Macbeth describes it this way, both explicitly and implicitly in the connotations of his diction. Much of the language in the speech is concerned with motion, of the passage of the individual through the various phases of human experience. Creeps, pace, day to day, way to dusty death, walking, shadow, struts and frets. And here I can't help pointing out a lovely, unnecessary, unexploited rhyme. That's the pleasing repetition of day to, in lines 2 and 3, and then way to in line 5. That connection is very far apart, but it's not something that we don't hear. Not only does the repetition of words and phrases generate a kind of mental electricity, but we also get patterns of logical or semantic oppositions of meaning, which create the same effect. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow against yesterdays in line 4, in line 2, out in line 5, death in line 5, life in line 6, heard no more in 3 lines from the bottom, then sound and fury. And the greatest of all those patterns of opposition is in that simple final pair of words signifying nothing, those 2 opposites occupying that simple phrase. This kind of logical contrast obviously serves the thematic ends of the drama, but it also supplies that mental exercise, that intellectual excitement that I've been promoting. But we might do just a little more with connotation. lingering for a moment over the word dusty. The OED doesn't do much with dusty apart from relating it to its nominal form, that is dust. But when we look at dust, we find a whole slew of connotations pertinent to disillusionment and death. Dust refers to, quote, the condition of humiliation, or to, quote, a type of that which is worthless, or, quote, that to which anything is reduced by disintegration or decay. And similarly productive is an analysis of the word fret, which gives us the opportunity to linger over an important word, but one which is only partially understood. In the first place, there's its auditory contribution. It sounds right. It goes sonically with struts. And in fact, we might say that the words establish a consonantal rhyme, a rhyme of consonants. That is, the vowels don't match, but the consonants do. And semantically, it seems appropriate as well, capturing, as it does, the proverbial narcissistic self-concern of the actor, the performers who display themselves, who strut their stuff, and who also fret about their performance. How was I? All of this is immediately available to us, and the fact that we are able to assemble and process all these associations within a second of hearing these three words is one of the great mental pleasures that Shakespeare inspires in us. And yet there's still more to it than this. We use fret almost exclusively as a synonym for worry. I have been fretting for weeks about this webinar. That is, we use it in that sense unless we are talking about a guitar, which has on its neck frets or markers for the positioning of the fingers. But this is one case in which etymology, especially historical etymology, can enrich our understanding of the passage. That etymological section from the Oxford English Dictionary there is very complicated, but if you look at it, you start recognizing what I'm talking about. The verb fret derives ultimately from sources in Old English fretin and the Middle Low German vretin, terms meaning to eat up, to devour, to graze, to let an animal eat up a crop. In other words, to consume, to destroy. The actor frets. He consumes or devours his hour on the stage and thus devours, destroys himself. It's an image of self-destruction, of eating oneself up. What is important is that this sense and the related uses of the word were very common in early modern English. As I say, it is a simple five-letter word meaning self-destruction, and Macbeth is about nothing if not about self-destruction. I don't have much of a conclusion. I have a simple quotation from my favorite critic. Stephen Booth is the critic from whom I have learned the most, as will be apparent to some of you from the things I have been saying. And Stephen Booth begins one of his great essays with the following sentence: Shakespeare is our most underrated poet. Thank you.
Thank you. I did receive some more questions during the course of the webinar. Would you like me to read out a few more?
Sure.
Joe Softy again asks, do you agree with Greenblatt's essay in the New York Times that you mentioned at the beginning, with the one qualification that it has gotten more difficult to appreciate the quote-unquote subtle magic?
Well, as I think I tried to indicate, I'm not quite so willing to give up. I think that it's incumbent upon us to find ways to connect with students and to pass along the pleasures of that language. So while I agree with him about the effects that he sees, that there is less delight in the language, that the subtle magic of the language, as he puts it, is more difficult to transmit, I disagree with him in thinking that we should just sort of go on to something else and teach another Shakespeare than the one I love.
All right, thank you. Bob Darcy wants to say excellent webinar. Thanks, Russ. And a question, let's have one more question. This one from Mary Nelson. What do you believe is the most accessible Shakespearean play for undergrad students? What is the least accessible?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, it's hard to say. In some ways, the Comedy of Errors is a really clear, excellent example of a Shakespearean comedy based as it is on twins. The fact is it's very short. It's one of the 2 or 3 shortest plays in the canon. It's pretty clear how it works, and students can get it. A Midsummer Night's Dream also practically never fails. So those are the 2 plays that I think that I would usually want to start with. As for the most difficult, you've got a lot of choice there. I was sort of surprised, in fact, as I said, that Mrs. Hartley taught us Antony and Cleopatra in the 12th grade, but it was a very rewarding experience, and she was able to convey to us the sense of color and majesty and distinctiveness about that tragedy. I wouldn't want to teach Coriolanus or those plays to beginning students. I also think that Julius Caesar is not a very good play with which to start, and I'm glad it's finding its way out of the curriculum in lots of cases.
Wow. All right, a couple more thank yous from Delaney Driscoll, Catherine H. Geranios, who says very interesting, and asks about the recording. We will be putting up the recording on our community website, community.macmillan.com, and we'll be sending out survey emails after the webinar's conclusion. Go ahead.
Sure, Jillian. Thank you so much. And this is Joy again. I just want to thank Russ McDonald for the wonderful presentation, the readings especially, and then answering all these questions. And thanks so much to all of you who have contributed today in this discussion. As you'll see on the last screen here, there's a link to learn more information about Russ's title, The Bedford Shakespeare. There's a link there. We'll also put it in the chat now for you. And as Jillian mentioned, we will be sending a short survey. You can look for that in the next hour. We encourage you to open it up and fill it out. There's actually a little gift in there for your participation today, and a link to the community site that Jillian just mentioned. And finally, if you have questions, you can see my email address included there, as well as Rachel Goldberg, who's our development editor for this project. And Russ, I give the final word to you.
I have no final word except thanks for everybody for giving up an hour.
Wonderful. All right, everyone, have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you.